Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to the virtual California African American Museum. For those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Alexandra Mitchell, and I'm delighted to be the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at CAM. We are so delighted to be gathered this evening to celebrate the release of an abolitionist handbook, now on sale and available via SOM Books in Leimert Park and online. In an abolitionist handbook, artist, author, and organizer Patrisse Cullors charts a framework for how everyday activists can effectively fight for an abolitionist present and future. Filled with relatable pedagogy on the history of abolition, a reimagining of what reparations look like for Black lives, and real-life anecdotes, the text offers a bold and humanistic approach to how to be a modern-day abolitionist. Cullors is a New York Times bestselling author, educator, artist, and abolitionist from Los Angeles, California, and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, which was nominated in 2021 for the Nobel Peace Prize. Patrisse has been on the front lines of abolitionist organizing for 20 years, and Time 100 also named her as one of the 100 most influential people in 2020. Patrisse has led multiple Los Angeles-based organizations, such as Dignity and Power Now, Justice LA, and Reform LA Jails. Joining Patrisse in conversation this evening is the incomparable Dr. Angela Davis. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Dr. Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. She's the author of 10 books, including Abolition Democracy and Are Prisons Obsolete? And a recent reprint of her pivotal work, Angela Davis, an autobiography. Dr. Davis has taught at universities all over this country and spent 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance and Sisters Inside, based in Queensland, Australia. Having helped popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Skye Patrick. Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016 after holding leadership positions at Broward County Library, Queens Public Library, and San Francisco Public Library. Patrick currently is responsible for its 86 libraries, an 18-vehicle mobile fleet, and servicing more than 3.4 million residents. In addition to helping LA County go fine-free and initiating a myriad of other services to provide more access and opportunities for customers, Patrick reinforces the library's role in community as a civic and cultural center. Preceding tonight's conversation, we will have a pre-recorded dance presentation by Versa Dance Style Company, a nonprofit organization and dance ensemble that consists of committed and conscientious artists representing the diversity and beauty of complexity in Los Angeles. They seek to empower and understand marginalized groups worldwide through the movement and culture of hip hop dance by creating groundbreaking concert dance works that represent messages of diversity, inclusion, and equity, both on stage and within our communities. Before we begin this evening, I would like to deeply thank our partners at the LA County Library. This program is presented as part of their Trailblazers and Conversation series. And now, Versa Dance Style Company.
Welcome to LA County Library's Trailblazers series in partnership with the California African American Museum, lovingly known locally as CAM. I want to thank Versa Styles Dance Company for their contribution to tonight's program. And of course, I have the dubious honor of welcoming Dr. Angela Davis and Ms. Patrisse Cullors to our Trailblazers series. So without further ado, let's get into this. We have a lot of questions to ask and a lot to learn from these two titans. Thank you so much, Patrisse. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to celebrate Patrisse's new book. Thank you for writing it, Patrisse.
Thank you, Angela, for
and
being
for all of your work.
Thank you. And thank you for being such a guidepost for me and for so many abolitionists, young abolitionists, to believe in something that for so long, many people told us was unbelievable. So I appreciate you. And I'm always grateful to be in conversation with you. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just grateful to be able to be the moderator in this conversation, to sort of be a fly on the wall. So let's ask the questions. We started to talk about abolition. So there are many people on this call. We have over 6,000 people who have chosen to spend this evening with the two of you. But I think a lot of the folks in the audience will know what you're talking about. There are some folks on the call who may be new to abolitionism. So can you share what abolitionism looks like in the modern day, and what is it today for people who don't understand?
Angela, I'm going to have you start.
I was about to say, you wrote the book, Patrisse, but maybe I can just provide a little background. The abolition with which most people are familiar is the movement to end slavery, anti-slavery abolition. But there have also been other abolitionist campaigns. I mean, for example, death penalty abolitionism. And both of these abolitionist movements are linked to prison abolition and police abolition. And I should say that recently, Dorothy Roberts has called for what she terms the abolition of the child and family service system, or
Yes.
what she refers to as the family policing system, which is linked to the foster system. But I think it may be important to point out that not every abolitionism is, in my opinion, progressive. Those of us who call for abolition feminism challenge feminists who call themselves proponents of the abolition of prostitution. Instead, we support the self-organization of sex workers, and those who argue that sex work does not have to be inherently demeaning for women, young gay men, trans and non-binary people. But I do think it's helpful to think of 19th century abolition as directed against slavery, 20th century abolition as directed against what we might call racist inspired second-class citizenship. In other words, what we generally refer to as the civil rights movement. 21st century abolition is directed against prisons, police, and all of the other carceral structures that are linked to racial capitalism, global capitalism that define our lives today.
That's why I had her start. And Skye, I'll just add to that, because I really am a mentee of Angela's work around abolition, and have, I feel honored and blessed that I have been able to learn from you, Angela, but also, so many of us have been grappling with this concept of abolition and what it looks like and what it means for our lives. In this book, I also argue that abolition is truly how we show up for each other. We have digested the, an economy of punishment, economy of revenge. We have really created, we didn't create it, but we have succumbed to how policing is culturally impacted how we are in relationship to each other, how the judge and the court system. And so I'm also calling for an abolitionist culture, and that we move towards a culture of care. And I'm really arguing that abolition is challenging, in the book I say cancel culture. I don't really like that term anymore because it's been co-opted. Now I'm really saying carceral culture. Mm-hmm. How do we challenge carceral culture in our everyday lives within our communities, as we are trying to abolish a prison system, abolish a police system, a court system, and many of these systems that are so intrinsically tied to the police state.
And let me just very quickly thank Patrisse for writing this handbook for abolitionists, because theories and practices of abolition are now being discussed in the mainstream. So it's so important to insist on its radical quality, its revolutionary revolutionary edge, I guess I would say. And so I would like to thank Patrisse for always foregrounding abolition, especially its anti-racist, anti-capitalist character, its opposition to heteropatriarchy. And thank you Patrisse, for the handbook, which makes abolition an everyday question, and which encourages us to make changes in ourselves and in our communities that allow us precisely to imagine an abolitionist future.
Cue the tears.
I was going to say, it's already mic drop. That was the first question. I love that you've just like opened this conversation up, because you play right into my next question. This is for both of you. Just challenging the carceral culture. When you talk about each of us showing up for each other, Patrisse, I think this is perfect, because I want to ask you both about transformative justice and what that means and how it looks in action in our communities. How does that practice look? How do we do it? For those of us who are not necessarily as learned as the rest of us on this call, can you share with us what you think?
Yeah, I can start this time, Angela. And I think, I was really, how I came to abolition and transformative justice is really through what I experienced as a young person living inside Los Angeles, and experiencing the war on drugs and the war on gangs in real time, and the complete decimation of the communities that I was living in. And truly, the stripping of the dignity and the humanity of my family members every single day by the police state, by the social welfare system, by all these systems that blamed us for being poor, blamed my mom for being poor, blamed her children for being poor. And there is a quality that has, it's the quality of humiliation. So it's both the material conditions that are impacting our everyday lives and are impacting the ways that we can be mobile in our everyday lives, but there's also the trauma that one suffers at the hands of these systems. And I was really seeking for something different. And I came across a workshop, a critical resistance workshop on the prison industrial complex. And really, had this, 2-hour workshop, maybe 10 of us in a room. This was almost 20 years ago. And it was the first time I was hearing, that prison was an industry, and all of these light bulbs were, coming off for me, as I was someone who was all the time visiting my loved ones inside of juvenile halls and prisons and county jails, or witnessing, that police, pick my brothers up and his friends up. And then this concept of like, okay, well, if people don't go to prison, well, then what do we do? And this concept of transformative justice, well, transformative justice really being transforming the harm that was caused, but also transforming the conditions in which that harm was caused. Because the current system tells us that the people who are poor, people who are committing harm, well, I want to say this differently. The current system tells us that the only people who commit harm are poor people and Black people. And there are so many different types of harm that happens. Police commit harm, corporations commit harm. And so we've really created a system in which when we think about criminality, we only think about poor people, Black people, brown people. And so, for me, unlearning that and being able to sift through that and then think about, wow, how do I practice this in my life? Many people know on this call, and the both of you know this very well, I'm the primary caregiver for my brother who has severe mental illness, and has spent truly most of his life at the hands of the police and prison state. And I knew from a very young age that he needed something different. We needed something different. And so I started practicing transformative justice in real time, in my own family unit. We knew we couldn't call the police if my brother was in the middle of a manic episode. And so we had to figure out what else could we do? How could we as a community come together to support him and support each other? And those were, for me, that was the, very early stages of me practicing abolition. For me, abolition is the framework in which transformative justice sort of lives under, healing justice lives under, mutual aid lives under. And so practicing those things inside of my community became a priority because it was really about life or death. When you realize that, if you call the police on a loved one, that there's a possibility of them losing their life, you have to figure out another option. And transformative justice became that other option for me and my family and community.
Dr. Davis, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think Patrisse has been so eloquent in responding to that question. I'll only say that, what Patrisse describes in her relationship with her brother, especially, which you wrote about in your first book, and allows us to recognize that we need a different kind of justice system, that retributive justice, justice based on, or so-called justice based on vengeance and retribution is not justice. And so I think it's important to see the way in which practices at the everyday level can mirror a future to come, that we can have an entire system of justice that's based on these transformative practices rather than on retributive practices.
Yeah, that's deep already. Again, we're just getting started here. Yeah, Patrisse, you talk about, the police in your neighborhood stripping you and your family in your community of your dignity and being blamed. The thing I wrote down here is making it illegal, essentially, to be poor.
That's right.
This brings me to another question. I would love to hear both of you spar dialogue on this idea between the relationship between mental health, trauma, and incarceration. It has only come to my understanding in the time that I've known of you, Patrisse, like really talking about and understanding how so many people here in Los Angeles County specifically who are put into prison, but they have mental health issues. They're neurodivergent. And can you both kind of talk about what is the relationship? I think I know what you might say, but I want to hear you say it.
Do you want to start this time, Angela?
Yeah. Well, I was actually thinking about the fact that the disability movement has played a really important role in the shaping of what we now call the abolitionist movement. Because in the 1970s, there was this campaign to get rid of psychiatric institutions precisely because they could not respond to the needs of people who were in pain. And as a matter of fact, to a certain extent, that campaign was successful because the huge mental institutions that almost everybody was aware of in every state were disestablished. The problem was, and this is where the lessons for our contemporary abolition movement are so important. The problem was that they did not create a new structure. They simply opened the doors, got rid of the institution, but did not create the kinds of agencies that would and the kinds of institutions that could more compassionately respond to people who have traumatic experiences and challenges with mental health. I think it's really important to have a feminist approach to this question. And when I say feminist, I mean not so much being attentive to gender, although we should be attentive to gender, but being intersectional and interrelational in our thinking, to bring things together that don't usually come together. And I think it's so important to learn from the disability movement, what worked and what did not work. And as a matter of fact, today, people who have mental challenges are not automatically locked up, although there still is a lot of incarceration. But as I said before, we have to think about what it might mean to create the kinds of transformative institutions that would attend to people who have mental disorders, but also we have to figure out how to challenge the normalcy of what is referred to as able-bodied people and neurodivergency. Those who experience it have an enormous amount to contribute. They may see the world differently, but like artists, we can benefit from their different ways of envisioning the world. So I think what this says is that we have a lot of work to do. And we cannot just focus myopically on one question, that we have to reimagine the entire society.
Right. Yeah, Angela, you've used this term before, economy of violence. And when I think about the impact this current system, especially in LA County, has on people who suffer from mental health disorders or severe mental illness, I think about how we're really living in an economy of violence inside of LA County. The level of violence leveraged against disabled bodies is disturbing and honestly depressing. And I think, as I, grew up really supporting my brother and recognizing that there is, no support inside this county. And we spent, many of us spent a decade plus, groups like Dignity and Power Now, Justice LA, YJC, Critical Resistance, challenging two jails that were going to be built in this county, one of which was a mental health jail. And now I believe the county supervisors that have, the new county board of supervisors, we would be embarrassed to even think that that was a plan that was going to happen in this town. But for a long time, people told the abolitionists that we were the ones who should be quiet, that it was already going to happen, that they were projecting towards how many people were going to need to be in those jails, and there was no logic around why we would put people with mental health issues inside of cages. There was no real logic. And, I believe that through our abolitionist framework and also pushing an abolitionist, really sharing that abolition is a concrete policy demand, really did change the county and its approach. And we do have a long ways to go, but it's very powerful, especially as an Angelino born and raised here, and who has been an unapologetic abolitionist in relationship to the county, to see the county create, entire structures now that is trying to figure out, how do we build a Los Angeles that really does look at how we treat folks who are neurodivergent. And I think that's really powerful. And I'll say we have to be very careful about just saying abolition and not imagining something else. And so part of our job as abolitionists is to say, yes, get rid of this thing. It does not work. But it's also part of our job to be on the foreground of saying, and this is what does work. This is what's possible. This is what's necessary. Because so often what has happened is, you know, we sit with county leaders and they say, okay, we can get rid of this thing, but we actually don't have anything in place. We don't have enough beds, we don't have enough infrastructure, and it takes time to build infrastructure. And so part of our job is to keep keep the fire lit, right? And reminding people that here's these infrastructures that have to exist. And the last thing I'll say is, I haven't been yet, but so many people have shared with me, and now it's in threat, the public mental health system in Italy, in Trieste, Italy, one of the most progressive public mental health cities, you know, in the world. It's actually a world-renowned mental health city where folks who have mental health issues are not criminalized for their mental illness. And in fact, they are celebrated and supported. And it's the whole family and community that come together to celebrate and support folks. And now it's under attack by their right-wing government to be privatized. You know, we have a pretty much completely privatized system in Los Angeles, our mostly privatized system. And I've seen the firsthand how terrible a privatized system is. And so, you know, this is really a moment, given how the increased right-wing government and cultures across the world and countries that people are facing. It's a time for us to challenge it. I feel the urgency of abolition. I've been feeling the urgency of abolition for my whole life, but I feel the urgency of abolition right now during this pandemic. You know, as we witness the racial uprisings, there's something that we can carve out in this moment. There's something we could build anew in this moment. And I think it's going to take all of us to make that happen.
You know, it makes me think of the work that we do here in libraries.
I think Angela wanted to say something else.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon.
I was just going, since we're talking about books, I was just going to mention a book by Leah Ben Moshe, which is entitled, I believe, Decarcerating Disability. And it's a wonderful look at that whole history, and at she argues that we have a tendency to assume that the reason why there's such large numbers of people behind bars today is precisely because of the success of the anti-psychiatric movement. And the fact that there are large numbers of people on the street who are characterized as mentally ill and who are then arrested and placed in the county jails. It has been argued that LA County and Cook County and Rikers Island are the three largest mental institutions in the country. But what she argues is that we can't forget that it's global capitalism that is responsible for the failure to address the kinds of questions which would minimize the numbers of people who are in the street, the numbers of people who are without homes and who are forced to rely on whatever they can discover in the streets in order to survive. So, you know, neoliberalism is that you know, has to be pointed out here as the reason why the current situation exists. And I think that it's so important always to bring capitalism, because I've been trying to do this all my life, but into the frame. We can't forget that that is the background of all of these problems with respect to racism and class issues, heteropatriarchy.
Thank you for that. So many great tributaries I could go down here just based on these responses. You know, we do have, I have to say, Patrisse, I've seen the work that you've done here in the county and abroad, but really centering mental health as a priority. And it's through the movement work that you've been a part of, quite frankly, that I've seen the Board of Supervisors really change their direction and start looking at other alternatives like the Care First Village. That's one great option. And it's come from the advocacy, the boots on the ground advocacy. So when people think that you can't change policy and you can't change government, I mean, all they have to do is look at this movement. Look at the work that you have done and the people here in Los Angeles County have done to say, we want something different.
That's right.
This leads me to another question, and you both kind of touched on it, but I think it's just such an exceptional question. I'd like to ask it. With the legacy of slavery, resulting in generations of lost economic, social, educational advancement opportunities for Black Americans, how does abolitionism align with the reparations movement? I actually even want to take this a little bit further to extend it to the indigenous struggles for decolonization, the recognition of sovereignty and land repatriation movement. How do you see abolitionism advancing these movements specifically? And if I could ask Dr. Davis, go back and forth.
Well, I do think it's important for us to acknowledge that we're doing work in the 21st century that really should have begun in the immediate aftermath of slavery.
That's right.
We're over 150 years too late here. So what that means is that we not only have to be attentive to the whole project of reparations, which, as you pointed out, should also embrace indigenous people, because racial capitalism was produced both by colonialism and slavery. Colonialism and slavery are intertwined. They're not two separate phenomena. And I think as people of African descent, we have to be really conscious of the extent to which the struggles of Black people in this country were very much dependent on the mutual aid that was provided by indigenous people. And that we cannot tell our story without also engaging the stories of indigenous people. That's first of all. Then I think, let me try to be succinct here, because as you know, Patrisse, I can go on. But I do think it's important to acknowledge the relationship between slavery and the current prison system. Sometimes people treat it as an analogy that being in prison is like being enslaved, but actually there is what you might call a genealogical relationship between them. In the aftermath of slavery, instead of addressing the issues that would have allowed for the incorporation of people of African descent into a democratic society on a basis of equality, everything remained the same. Simply, the system was pronounced as abolished, and that it wasn't really even abolished, because the system itself, the system of slavery, wasn't one discrete institution. Its tentacles were everywhere in the society. And so by simply addressing the question of breaking the chains, but leaving everything else intact, the legacies of slavery continue to assert themselves. And precisely because of the failure to address the economics, the political, the cultural issues, the social issues, the economic issues, it became necessary to treat Black people as superfluous, as not a part of this society, and prisons developed as a depository for these populations that were considered superfluous. And of course, working class, poor white people as well. But I think it's important to insist on the essentially racist foundation of the penitentiary in the US. So that means that we're still struggling against slavery right now. We are. We're still doing anti-slavery abolition work because, as Du Bois pointed out, abolition would have required us to address, all of the ways in which slavery shaped the culture and the institutions. Slavery is still embedded in the educational institutions, all of the economic institutions, the cultural institution. So we're still doing this work. And I think that that reparations have to be about revolutionizing our society.
Yes.
Not just about money and not primarily about giving people cash, but rather about retooling the society. And if it's retooled in order that the descendants of indigenous people, the descendants of people of African descent can be incorporated into the society on a basis of equality, that will be democracy for everyone, not just for Black people and not just for people of color, but for everyone. So that's my little piece.
I don't think I need to answer.
Do you want to follow that, Patrisse?
I don't need to. I literally was snapping at everything. I was like, yes. No, I feel like so many important points were made, Angela, in that. And I think, like, for the audience, more specifically, this idea of abolition for a long time, really up until the last couple of years, was so on the fringe. It was a conversation we've been trying to sort of like have. It was a scary word, And I remember going into county board of supervisor meetings and them being like, I mean, we're not abolitionists. We know you all are, but we're not. But I feel like it's been less scary over time. And, it really, some of the points you're making, Angela, just around like, we have to contend with the fact that we didn't end slavery. And what does that mean? If we are a part of, if we truly believe in democracy, if we truly believe in challenging the impact capitalism has had, racial capitalism has had on all of us, it means we have to contend with the fact that we did not end slavery, which means that every one of us need to be a part of this movement to end slavery, to end the policing and imprisonment of human beings. And I think once people recognize that it's not an issue that's over there for these people to figure out, that it's actually an issue for all of us, and that this fight for abolition is truly a planetary fight. It's a fight for the survival of this planet, that I think people start to understand it differently.
And the cover of your book takes us back to the era of slavery. As soon as I saw it, I said, right on. I think we can talk about abolitionist temporalities because we're living in different times and we're still contending with the times of slavery. And at the same time, as you point out so eloquently over and over in your book, we're trying to imagine a different way of being in the world, our relationships, the ways in which our institutions serve our needs. So thank you for, as I was reading, I was underlining almost every other page. So not in this beautiful book, but in the PDF that I read.
Good, that's what we want people to do.
Exactly. But I love also the highlighter that has, what is it? Abolition?
Abolitionist, evangelist.
Yes.
I mean, I've always been an abolitionist evangelist, but I really do feel like when the pandemic happened, I don't know for you, Angela, as an abolitionist, like how this pandemic has impacted just how you think about abolition. But I feel like, by week 3, I was like, wait a second, this is a really good time to start telling people a new world could exist, y'all. Like, you see how this thing is falling apart? Like, for many of us, it had never worked, but for a lot of people, they're seeing the fall of racial capitalism right now, and that there's a possibility of something else on the other side of that. And I feel like this is the time to be abolitionist evangelists, to evangelize about what abolition can bring to people's lives if we call for it.
Patrisse, my first exposure to abolition was 1971, long before any of you who ever thought of, and it was from the Attica brothers.
Yes.
And so for me, it's so amazing to realize that from that relatively small number of people, and there were some abolitionists in other parts of the world as well, who had this idea that it might be possible to abolish prisons. To the present moment, it's like we've leapfrogged in time, because I feel like I'm living in a future that I never imagined I would witness. I knew that there would come a time when there would be abolition evangelists like Patrisse Cullors, who would be sending the message out to huge numbers of people. But I didn't think I would ever witness that in my lifetime. I thought that would come sometime in the future. And of course, we can never predict how history is going to turn and how conjunctures happen just like that. And then all of a sudden, everything is different and conditions are such that people then begin to think seriously about an issue which many of us felt would not come to fruition, maybe 2050, maybe 2075, maybe the year 3000. So I feel like I'm in an Octavia Butler novel. I'm living in a future when people are talking about abolition.
Yeah.
Openly, and standing on the shoulders of the great work that you and many other people have done before this generation. So I thank you, and I know Patrisse has already thanked you. Both of you talked about this idea of survival and surveillance in some regards, and being an abolitionist evangelist, excuse me. I've wanted to ask both of you this question for a long time, and I have you here, so I have to ask it. Both of you are supreme Black female leaders. And I think we're often disregarded and attacked whenever whenever we're at the forefront of a critical movement or even just a discourse. I'd love for you to share with this audience tonight what it's like to be there, what it's like to be surveilled, quite frankly, doxxed in some cases, and threatened and with bodily harm, because this work is so important. What has that felt like for both of you to be threatened, frankly?
I'll start. I've been obviously in conversation with the both of you privately, and then with the public more recently, and a really beautiful LA Times article that was written by Donovan X. Ramsey. I want to give him a huge shout out. And I didn't know that journalism could be healing. I didn't know that it could be transformative. I truly believe he's a trauma-informed journalist, and I hope that more journalists, especially in this time, will see the necessity to protect, and not in the sort of like traditional sense of protection, as in like, not share the hard parts of being movement leaders, but protect Black women in the ways that we are so often not protected by a white supremacist patriarchal system. I vacillate. I've always, I have experienced death threats and things like that for a really long time now. It's almost been, I think a decade that I've experienced the constant harassment. It wasn't until last year, though, that I really did think I was going to lose my life at the hands of vigilantes because of right-wing media. And I really had to think about, like, do I want to be public again? Is it, is it time for me to just like close my door, raise my kid? Like, I'll, support the movement privately on my own. But I realized that I don't know how to do that. So that's not going to happen. It's like not, it's really in my nature to speak out and be public in that way. But also that's the point. The point is to scare us into hiding, into and to not speaking up and not showing up. So I think, every day is different. Obviously, when I'm like on a Zoom with like two powerful Black women, I'm like, yeah, I got this. Like, and nobody could touch me. And then, other times I feel much more vulnerable. I feel much more scared. I feel much more worried. And I think, we're living in a very scary time. I think while we no longer have Trump in office, he obviously resurrected and gave true presence to white supremacists to be unapologetic and emboldened, and then created a movement out of that, a real movement that is backed by a full-on press house that is used against so many of us so often. And I think that is, if I were to sit and obsess about it, I would not be well. And so I try my best to, do the things that are good for me, go to therapy, do exercise, hang out with my kid and my family and community. But it is, there are moments where I'm like, wow, I really am just asking for a better world for all of us. And the response to that is rather extreme, given that I do believe that the world that I'm, evangelizing about is not just going to be a world that's just good for Black people. I think it's going to be good for all of us, for every single human being and plant being and any being that's on this planet. And so those are the moments where I get really like confused, like, why would you want to harm me if I really actually want to make sure everybody else is not harmed? But then I remember that it's just, I am a part of a legacy of freedom fighters and movement leaders who have challenged white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism. And the response to that has been vitriol and at worst death. And obviously, all of our political prisoners who are inside of, a US prison or jail who need to come home now, that are impacted because of their fight against this system. So I have to also remember, it's not personal. It's not because I'm Patrisse Cullors, it's because I'm part of a long legacy of folks. And obviously, Angela, I think about you all the time. And you've been one of the primary elders who I've reached out to during this time, and who's, when everything really started happening, I called Angela and she said, yeah, this was gonna happen. I'm like in a really like loving and tender way, but you were just like, this is a par for the course. I wish it wasn't, but this is what happens. This was going to happen. And so knowing that, I think the biggest thing for me has been trying to figure out I'm a strategist, like I'm a problem solver. So I'm like, okay, if I know this is going to happen to me often, like what are the things that I could set in place so that there could be less blowback on me, but also I'm very much thinking about the next generation of Black women. I keeps me up at night thinking about, the next generation of Black abolitionists, especially women, and like how I protect them, or what conditions can I set up so they're more protected than I was, or than Angela was.
Wow, thank you, Patrisse. I think about what Audre Lorde said, that it's not possible, that we don't have to be immobilized by our fear, that we can be afraid, we can be scared to death, and we can continue to act if we come together. And my entire life, I've had to address these issues. When I went to jail, I thought I was going to end up in the gas chamber, and I can remember, and I've described this before, I can remember not even wanting to go there because I would get so scared that I would spend my last days walking down this corridor into a gas chamber. But then as the movement around my case began to grow and develop, I realized that I had been imagining myself as being alone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had been imagining myself as a solitary individual. And that when I began to think about the fact that I really was not alone, there were all of these people, many of whom I didn't even know personally, who were with me. So whenever those images of walking into the gas chamber would come into my mind, I would conjure up all the people who were with me, and I would say that, if I go, I will not be going alone. There will be hundreds and thousands and millions of people with me. And so over the years, that has been what I have turned to not so much to assuage the fear, because the fear can be there, and it should be there, because we have a reason to be afraid. White supremacy is dangerous, it's violent. But if we simply capitulate to that and go into our shells, we will be doing exactly what they want. Yeah. So I think the issue is to build a movement that's larger and larger, and learn how, and Patrisse, I so appreciate how you take us to a different place in your book about, you take us to places that usually are not considered when we're talking about political transformation. So how can we encourage a new sensibility that is collective? Yes. And that is not based on capitalist individualism, which is basically what that is about. When we think of ourselves as completely alone, we're revealing the influence of capitalism. So how do we cultivate that community? How do we create that sense of togetherness, so that if something does happen to us, one of us, all of us, we'll still be spiritually present in the work that continues. And I try to think about that, because I know that so many of my comrades have fallen to that white supremacist violence, to state violence, and I see myself as representing them. Yes. That as long as I continue to struggle, that they're spiritually present in the work that we do. Mm. And that means that we have to begin to think of ourselves in such a different way. And you broach that, you explore that in your book. What would it mean to create completely new human beings?
Right.
Yeah, I have here, based on what both of you are saying, the collective, Dr. Davis just reinforms that, just reasserts that, the coalition building, the community. And you do talk about that in your book, and I'm going to get to that, Patrisse, I promise you. I want to ask one more question before we move on. I have about maybe 5 more minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to our visitors here. This is for both of you. Dr. Davis, in your book, you say the radicalness of imagery as a space for what is yet unthinkable. I mean, I had to pause on that a couple of times and reread it. I actually sent it to a couple of friends. Can we talk about this idea about the cultivating the imagination and how that can lead and how that has led to both of your practices? I know, Patrisse, first and foremost, you're an artist. You're a prolific artist. I've had the pleasure of seeing your studio. I've had the pleasure of listening to you unravel and reassemble ideas around art and its infrastructure and the abolition of art as we know it in museums. I want to hear what you think about imagination. I read it, but I want to hear you say it.
You know, in these principles and these steps that I outline in the book, there's a whole step on say yes to your imagination. And I really believe that part of the efficiency of white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism has been the stealing of our imagination. Angela knows this, right? When you go and do a workshop, you talk about abolition and first thing people, well, wait a second, what are we gonna do? And you know, there's gonna be utter chaos. And it's almost as if people think that police and prisons as we know it has always existed for all of humanity. And that there has never been another way and there's never can be another way. And so and I've been saying this for years, like, you know, pre-BLM, you know, early Patrisse days, as a young activist, one of the first things that I would do when I would meet young people or I would do a workshop, the first thing I would say to everybody is like, close your eyes and I want you to just imagine. I want you to imagine something different than what currently exists. And I want you to give yourself the permission, because oftentimes we don't give ourselves the permission to imagine something different. And you know, this was in the early days of stopping the jail plan when the county told us that we were being silly and ridiculous. I would ask people to imagine what you do with $3.5 billion. And no one, and I mean no one, would ever say I would build a jail. No one said that. And so we have the ability, we already are imagining something different, and applying that to abolition is just the next step. And so for me, it's such a critical practice, the imagination practice. It's something that I like to do on a daily basis. It's, you know, it's what children do. It's such an important part of your evolution as a human being, is to play and imagine. It's so important for how we grow up, and we should not lose that part. And so I really encourage folks to use the imagination as part of your abolitionist practice.
And let me say that I've always been so inspired by your commitment to art and the centrality of art and cultural work to the struggle, and specifically to abolitionist practices. Because I truly believe that, as you point out, we can imagine a different world if we educate our imagination, if we allow our imagination to go free. And you know, oftentimes art can make us feel what we haven't yet figured out how to say. And therefore art should never be an auxiliary to our movements, but rather should be at the very heart of our struggles. I'm just so happy now to see all of this beautiful visual art. You know, Gina is, my partner Gina Dent is involved in a ongoing project called Visualizing Abolition, which is about visual art and abolition, but also about music and abolition. You know, what does it mean to create abolitionist music? And when we think about art and music, we never imagine ourselves as alone. We never imagine ourselves as solitary. We always think of ourselves in community. And I think art can take us places where we would never be able to go if we simply relied on the capacity to engage in, this kind of a dialogue, which is important. It's wonderful, but I think it's not all about being able to say it. It's also about being able to feel it. And art reaches the emotions in ways that are transformative.
Both of you just keep leaving me speechless. Yes, art is what happens when you haven't figured out how to say it. I'm gonna marinate on that one. Thank you for that. I have so many other questions, but I am gonna wrap this one up with one last question. It's a two-part question for both of you, and then we're gonna open the floor. I haven't had an opportunity to properly evangelize the library, the public library, which I often do. Patrisse knows this about me. But, I think for our library listeners who are just really intrigued by this conversation, I think all of them would want to know two things. Can you share with us an early experience you had with the public library? And what are you reading? What are you reading? I read you. What are you reading?
I lived at the library. That was literally was my safe space growing up. And actually now, I'm really glad you're asking this question, because I'm like, I don't actually think I've taken my child to the library. So I need to make that, I need to take him to your library, Skye. But every library, any place I lived, I always tracked where the library is. I needed to know where the library was. It was a place I went to after school. It's a place that we couldn't afford books. So it's where I got my books. And the downtown library specifically was a library that I spent a lot of my post-high school years at that library. Whether it was, I was houseless as a young queer kid. So whether it was sleeping at the library and like being able to take naps and read and take naps, it really felt like a sanctuary, the library for me. So I have very, very, very fond memories of the public library system. And it's just making me think how I need to pass those memories down to my kids. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that, Patrisse. I know that the city library is on this call right now. Shout out to our sisters in the city, even though we're the county. Dr. Davis.
Well, the library was as important to us growing up as the church was. And living under conditions of segregation, Black people weren't allowed to go to the main library. But we had a librarian, a Black librarian. Her name was Mrs. Bell. And as a matter of fact, I could talk about her, but I'll save that for another time. And finally, we got a brick structure, maybe about 7 or 8 blocks from my house, which was the Black library. And that library is still there today. We spent more time in that library. My mother was a teacher. So she taught us how to read when all of us learned how to read by the time we were 3. And we had these competitions in the summer for how many books we could read and then describe. So we had to go to the library once a week, check out our books and make sure that we had read all of them before it was time to go the next week. But for me, the library was an entrance to a world that we could not otherwise access. So that's where I learned how to move out of this, the small space of, what was the Black neighborhoods, and there were only a couple of Black neighborhoods in the city, and we literally were not able to walk in white neighborhoods, and so the library was not so much an escape as it was an entrance to new worlds and new futures. So I'll never forget Miss Bell. She was one of the heroes of my childhood.
So I'm now obligated to track her down and at least know where she landed. We're on that already, Dr. Davis. That's exactly my experience with the library, both of your experiences. I was going to say earlier, we were talking about imagination. When I was a child, I used the library, I used reading as a way to imagine a different world. Also, not a world that was kind, but it was an opportunity. The library gave me an opportunity to see the world through new lenses. So I love that the two of you have said that. I am now going to open the floor to questions. I have to tell you, there are like 100 here in the chat. So I'm going to do my best to try and get through a few of these questions for the two of you. Here's a question that I actually started to ask, but I didn't get a chance to get to it. So Natalia asks, where can one start building abolition within a retributive, family structure? I'm going to actually ask Patrisse that. What do you think? How would you respond to that question?
So I'm just going to go to my book because I just wrote one, and I'm going to start with this first chapter, which is Courageous Conversations. The basis of the 12 steps, it really starts with courageous conversations. And this is not like a new concept. I didn't make this up, but it is something that has been a true ally of mine when leaning into an abolitionist practice. And so as a young person, I grew up in a household where we got spankings. And when I got older, my mom really confronted that. That's how she was raised. She didn't know that it was wrong. And we started having these conversations as I turned into an adult, her really questioning herself and that choice. And a lot of that had to do with, we helped raise my nephew, my brother's son, and we made a family choice that he wouldn't be spanked. And that was a courageous conversation we had as a family. And, in those early conversations, I told my mom, like, I will be, I'm going to help raise him, but I will not be spanking him. That will not be a practice of mine. And it made her, she kind of questioned, like, oh, okay, well, did you feel some kind of way that I spanked you? And absolutely I did. And she was stunned. She was very stunned, and she also felt really ashamed. And we spent a lot of time talking about it and processing what that meant. And so I start there, Natalia, as you're thinking about how you build abolition inside of your own family structure, is having the hard conversations, if it's safe, right? About what kind of family unit you want to have, what kind of culture you want to build in your family. I say that I am abolitionist. I'm being an abolitionist parent. I'm leaning on treating my child as an autonomous being and really facilitating his life and sharing with him what is possible inside of community, inside of a collective. He's really learning about the land and ecology. And so I think part of that conversation is like, what are your values? What is your value set? My values are an extension of my political practice, which is abolition. And so that's how I am walking. That's how I'm doing my best to walk that walk inside of my own family as well.
Sorry, unmute. We have a question here, and this was also one of the questions that I had on my list to ask, or very close to it. Oh, I'm so sorry, I lost it. Where'd it go? Okay, here's one from Val. With respect to imagining something else, are there real and permanent alternatives under capitalism, or is socialism the only or best solution? Can we start with Dr. Davis on that one?
Well, first, let me thank Patrisse for addressing the question of retributive family culture, because we all have that in our backgrounds. And thank you so much for making the link between that family culture and the state violence, because they both help to reproduce each other.
Right.
And so I just lost your question, because I'm starting to think about Patrisse's book, and I just lost the question.
You know, I have also moved, there's so many questions. Why don't you go ahead and talk about Patrisse's book?
Well,
while
I actually want to hear Angela answer this, because
I don't have it anymore, I'm sorry.
I found it.
Okay,
With respect to imagining something else, are there real and permanent alternatives under capitalism, or is socialism the only or best solution?
Right, yeah, exactly. You know, I don't think it's an either or situation. I don't think that we can assume that all we do is struggle for the abolition of capitalism and the creation of some kind of socialist society, and assume that, you know, all of the problems will be solved. Because if we do that, we'll be taking into that socialist world, you know, all of the problems that were created through and within this capitalist world. We literally embody these issues if we don't begin the process of addressing them now. If we ever get to a place of socialism, it won't be the kind of socialism that I would want to live under.
That's exactly.
Because we will be dealing with the same issues. So I think it's effective to think about struggles as a process, and not necessarily as struggles for freedom that will end once we reach that moment of freedom. Freedom is not a thing that we will encounter at some point in time that will allow us to rest and begin to do, you know, whatever else we might want to do. It will continue, and I think that certainly we can't assume that we can fully achieve what we want under capitalism, because capitalism is the problem.
That's right.
But at the same time, we have to begin the process of addressing, you know, all of these issues that are so embedded with racism and heteropatriarchy, and you know, all of the ways, the structural ways in which our exploitative society reproduces itself. I also want to say this, because I don't think I managed to say it during our entire conversation, and I will beat myself up if it ends without my saying it. Patrisse has already kind of alluded to the planetary magnitude of this struggle, that it's not just about the US, it's about the world, it's about the globe, it's about the planet. And I think that as we struggle to end this terrible system of capitalism, and as we deal with institutions like prisons and police and foster care system, and the ways in which those institutions have insinuated themselves into our personal relationships, into our family relationships, we encourage processes that will continue. that will help us to break down what are decades and centuries of structural racism and structural sexism and transphobia and homophobia. We do this work, and all of this work is pushing us somewhere else. And I think it's so important to recognize that there are people all over the world doing this. I always keep this picture of Marielle Franco. We were talking about Black women and surveillance and possibility of assassination. She was assassinated, but she did the kind of work that has inspired people all over the world to continue. And I think this is what we do. We do our work today, but at the same time, we reconfigure terrains of struggle and we pass down legacies to new generations, and that struggle continues. And I imagine that it will go on for not simply for decades, but for centuries. And we have to try to imagine that. Imagine 5 centuries from now, right, if the planet still exists, what kind of conversations will people be having? What kind of struggles will be going on? Hopefully not the same ones. I want new struggles, not the same ones that we've been embroiled in for the last, 150 years.
Thank you for that. I hate to say it. We have one more question, unfortunately, and there's so many good ones. This one I think is important because it really starts to frame and assist people who don't live in a more progressive area like Los Angeles. This one's from Constance, and she says, LA might be more progressive, but reality in the South, I think is what she's saying, is that time stood still. How does this change cover the whole United States? So I think where she's going is, how does she lead from where she's at in possibly a small town, or anyone else in areas that may not be as accepting or open to these kind of dialogues or discourse? Like, what kind of advice can you give someone who's out there and they feel like they're by themselves, but they want to invest in this movement and this work, but they don't have the community that you speak of? What's some advice you have?
Well, I'll just say that, yes, LA is, there are some progressive tendencies here, but that's not fully true. I think there's like this idea that LA is very progressive, but when it comes to matters of policing and criminalization, we actually are not that progressive. It's taken a progressive movement to move the city elected officials, county elected officials to move in that direction. I'll also say that there is really powerful and amazing work that has historically and presently happened in the South, and that movements inside the South often are the movements that change the rest of the country and challenge the rest of the country. The voting rights movement that's largely happening and being led by Black women in Georgia is really profound and powerful, and I think is part of the early piece of what you're saying, Angela, around needing to investigate all the ways that slavery impacted the system, including our relationship to voting and the voting right and voting rights. And so, I'm always a big fan of telling people, wherever you're at, find the local organization that you feel excited about, join it, become a member of it. We don't make change on our own. We make change in teams with communities inside of institutions that are progressive institutions, radical institutions, leftist institutions, that are abolitionist institutions that are challenging local governments. Stacey Abrams is going to run again if you're in Georgia. And if you're not in Georgia, if you're in the South, that's a national That's truly a national election. And so we should all be figuring out how we can make sure that she gets elected this time, and that the election isn't stolen from her. There's so much work that we can be doing to make sure that every place, but specifically in the South, I think the South is such an important political space, cultural space for Black people, and for all of us. And so looking at the work that's happening there with progressive people really led by Black women, I think that's a good place to start.
Dr. Davis, do you want to add to that, or?
Well, because of the existence of these new technologies of communication, which we're taking advantage of now to talk to thousands of people who are not in our vicinity, it means that people who live in places that are not necessarily progressive can find others, that can create community with others. So I would suggest that she, find other people. There are formations that have online meetings. We don't have to be limited by where we live now. And I think that one of the things that we need to insist on is that people who live in prison have access to the internet. In some places they do, but not in most prisons. I've done a couple of classes with people who are inside like this, virtually. And it was so exciting to have that kind of contact with people inside, at a time when the pandemic has created serious lockdowns of prisons. But I'm using this as an example. The person asking the question can have access to people, not only in this country, but in other countries. What's so exciting is that we can now communicate with people who are engaged in abolitionist struggles in Brazil or in South Africa or in Palestine. So, I'm not the best person to talk to about social media, and Patrisse knows this. I think I'm really backward in that respect, but I do take advantage of the fact that I can have conversations with people I could have never imagined having these conversations with before. Indigenous people in the Amazon who were struggling against the fires that Bolsonaro was encouraging there, and talking about racism and the commonalities of our struggles.
And so on that note, we're going to have to close this conversation. I don't want to have to do this, but yes, taking advantage of the technology. In my day, if you wanted progress or you wanted to be someplace, you had to move there. What I hear you saying and reflecting back is that that's no longer necessary. We can be in our sort of, I don't want to say metaverse, but our internet community, our cyber community, to create that sort of, and to create those relationships. This has been an unbelievably rich conversation, and I'm so sorry that we can't continue it. Please, yes, buy the books. There are 2 new books out by both of these authors. I want to thank all of you who tuned into the Trailblazers program. I want to thank, of course, the LA County Library Division of Education and Engagement. And there is a survey. Fill it out. Did you like this program? Let us know. Did you hate it? Let us know. We want to do more of these, but we need your feedback. So thank you so much, Alexandra, for Cam, and I'm going to turn the mic over to you to close us out.
My pleasure. I have to echo Skye's sentiments. This has been an incredible evening. I can't imagine having spent my Thursday night any other way. What an honor to have all 3 of you with us virtually. Unfortunately, we couldn't have you at the museum, but I do want to note that both the library and museum are open safely. So we invite you all to visit us very soon. Thank you again to our partners at the LA County Library, all of Skye, Dr. Davis, and Patrisse. These signed copies are still available via SOM Books. We encourage you to purchase via our bookseller for the night. Thank you very much. And we will make the dance performance available via YouTube for those of us that had trouble with sound. So thank you again. We hope to see you. Have a great evening. Be safe, be well. Congratulations and happy belated, Dr. Davis. Everybody have a great night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.